It's a laundry list of like. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're on now. Great. Thanks for sticking around for our last session of the morning. We're very lucky today to have Jim Compton with us from United Airlines. He is Vice Chairman and Chief Revenue Officer of the airline. In his role, he's responsible for, let me see if I get this right, sales, alliances, network planning, marketing, and of course, our frequent flyers in the Mileage Plus program. So Jim, welcome. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, thanks, guys. It's great to be here. I always have, my day job is Chief Revenue Officer. And when you're Chief Revenue Officer, the first thing you want to do is say thank you to all of you customers out there. And a number of you have said what status you are and things like that. Really appreciate your business, and it's great to be here today.
Full disclosure, I'm a silver, which is the lowest elite tier, but $25,000 a year.
Full disclosure, I follow Scott as he moves around.
So let's just start off talking about the industry in general. U.S. airlines are making record profits, posting best returns of any airlines on the planet. Investment ratings are coming up. You're spending a lot of money on new planes, fixing up the old airport terminals that we have. And last night, you guys released some guidance to investors saying revenue is better than we had expected, some costs are lower than we had talked about, and that you're on pace for an all-time record pre-tax earnings for this quarter. So tell us a little bit about where the industry's heading.
That's good. That's a good start. I think, but Scott, what you're describing is actually one of the things that gets me excited. I've actually been in the industry since 1984. And it's a very different industry. And what you're describing is really how the industry for the U.S. carriers has been very different over the last, kind of 4-ish to 5 years. And a lot of times you hear about record profits, and that's wonderful to hear and things like that. But I really believe the underlying story of that is really in the realm of, I call everybody winning. Right, and let me explain that a little bit, is that, in the world of sales in my area, when you build relationships with corporations or travel management groups and things like that, or in alliances that I have responsibility for, relationships are successful when they're win-win, right? The United Airlines, the industry in the US is successful because there's a win-win thing happening, right? The profits, and I thank you, Scott, for saying you didn't, usually people just start and say, the airlines are making record profits, right? But I appreciate what Scott just also alluded to, right? We're reinvesting a lot back into the business, back into our people. And so whether it's the airport experience, our clubs, whether it's our terminals, where we're doing groundbreaking, for instance, in Houston and building, across the system, those profits are very different from when I was in the 80s, where you were borrowing, basically, to make payroll many of the years. You're in a time when you're reinvesting. And when you reinvest in your people, you reinvest in the product, and you also return value back to shareholders. All constituents are winning, and we're seeing that in the industry today.
So a large part of these recent profits are thanks to the falling price of oil. Jet fuel prices this summer were 40% lower than they were last summer. Airfares have just come down a little, but we're talking maybe 2 or 3% here. Why aren't these savings being passed on to all of us so we can go to Disney World?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Actually, a lot of people are going to Disney World. But that's the underlying thing, right? The airline industry is, from a pricing perspective, we manage and price demand, right? We're what I call a market-based industry and less a cost-based industry, right? And so our ability to price is directly reflected on the demand that's in the marketplace. And that's what, on the revenue side, is the group that does the revenue management and pricing is looking to optimize the revenue based on the demand that's out there, right?
So what's more important, the profitability of the S&P 500 or the cost of oil to your airline?
Well, what's important to me is that we deliver what we say we're going to deliver, right? And oil prices is clearly a tailwind for us this year. But even in that environment again, it's a tailwind. The headwinds, and the title of our presentation was Headwinds. From that demand side, if you think about what our expectations of demand at the beginning of the year, and demand, a good way to think about demand in our business is what's GDP doing, not just US GDP, but world GDP. And if you went back to what expectations for demand, GDP, in January was to where it is today, throughout the year, expectations, not only actual has come down, expectations come down. Many of you write about China, you read about China, you've seen that in the international space. So we actually, back in our second quarter earnings call in July, guided kind of from a revenue perspective down 5 to 7%. I'd be happy with the 2 to 3, happier, not with the 2 to 3. But that 5 to 7 down that we guided to, and we narrowed that guidance last night in our investor update to 5.5 to 6% down, which is the little bit better revenue that Scott alluded to, is really because of that pressure of demand, the demand levels coming down from our expectations early in the year. The tailwind from fuel is definitely greater than that headwind.
So on that headwind, domestically, it's pretty good, but you're the largest carrier to Asia from the US, not so strong, and Europe has been a bit of a challenge. Where do you see those markets heading, and how do you adjust as an airline?
Yeah, and again, that's a great question. If you think about United Airlines, we're more international than our competitors. The 3 network carriers have a big international presence. We have the biggest international presence. We're very proud of that because international profitability has served us well over the years and continues to do so today. But as you alluded to, the domestic market has been a little bit more firmer than that international. So take a walk, basically you mentioned China, Scott. If you look at China, the expectations of demand have been slowing down. In our business, capacity we talk about it publicly being up about 20% from China to the US, being driven mainly by the growth of the Chinese carriers with the rights that we have exchanged, the governments. They're catching up with the bilaterals and exercising the rights that they've had. And so we've seen capacity grow 20%. And when capacity grows faster than demand, that's that market pressure on price, right? That we price demand out there. And so we've seen that pressure. We're excited about an area like China. A year ago, and again, it's always in the context of where we're at today and what we're hearing out of China. But a year ago, people talked by 2020, travel out of China will double by 2020 over the next, from 5 years and so forth. So even if you took half of that, it's a tremendous amount of growth that, given our presence in China, we're really, really excited about. So we take a long view of it. And just yesterday, we actually announced a secondary city in China, San Francisco to Xi'an, China, on our 787. And so we're pretty excited about the market. It's a unique space for us because we have a unique opportunity with the 787 to do that.
You stole my next question, which is, you haven't been focusing on growth to Beijing or Shanghai. It's secondary markets that you're now trying to fly sort of smaller planes into, but at least daily frequencies. So instead of taking US passengers to Beijing and connecting on, you're really looking at these markets. What's so appealing about them?
Yeah, well, so in that data that I described, if you take that 5-year period, expectations are half of that growth out of China is going to come from secondary cities. Where today, historically, that growth has come from Beijing and Shanghai.
So
right?
which cities are we talking about?
You know, there's a whole list, and many I can't pronounce, and I can see them, you know, in my eyes from my network folks. So, and I don't like to mention them anyway, because it is a very competitive business. But there are many, many cities in the secondary, and we see that space growing going forward.
Who's taking these flights from these secondary cities? Is it U.S. business travelers going over, or Chinese coming here?
Yeah, so at the margin, the expectation of growth is the Chinese travelers coming to the U.S. That will be, in terms of demand, that's our expectations, is that'll be the greatest part. You know, it's been about a year, but you know, even things that you know, the visas have a 10-year life and so forth. Travel is being each day becoming more easier to do, and you know, and so we see a lot of demand from the Chinese travel going forward.
In the headlines this week is, again, the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. 12 nations have agreed on this, but as you can see with our own government, there's some challenges one way or another. I know United has not taken a position on it, but as the largest carrier to Asia, how do you see that impacting flight?
Yeah, and we haven't taken a position on it, and so I won't speak to it specifically. You know, you know, at United, you know, our view is that is two things. One, in any, and again, I go back to the concept of relationships. It needs to be always a level playing field, right? And we're very interested in where it ensures that jobs in the U.S. grow and so forth. And so when I think about trade, and again, not this one specifically, because I haven't studied it that closely, and is how it would relate to the aviation industry or to us. That's in the back of my mind, right? Is it a level playing field, and does it create jobs, you know, in the U.S. and particularly for the folks at United Airlines, my colleagues?
One of the things that I always hear from flyers is aggravation over fees. But at the same point, you've been trying to shift that a little bit. Instead of just charging for bag fees, selling more leg room, faster security lines. You were the first airline in the US to give you the chance to pay to lock in a fare for up to a week. Right now, you're taking about $22 per passenger in these extra fees. Where's that going, and how do you guys see opportunities not to sort of anger passengers, but to?
Yeah, you know, the you know, that area we call the ancillary area, and you know, back in November 2013, I was in New York, and we talked to the investor community and talked about, by 2017, having $3.5 billion of our revenue being from ancillary, right? And we're right on path to do that, right? I have a team that manages our e-commerce and our merchandising that does tremendous work. And what they're trying to do is create choice, right? That what you want to do is give passengers choices of things they value and are willing to pay for. And so that's kind of the general concept around it. The ability to grow that, we talk about it in kind of 3 different areas. One is the more eyes you can get on your product, you're going to have, and the more relevant the way you offer it, you're going to drive more revenue, right? And so the team's done a terrific job of where customers want to, know about United and understand the products we offer. We're getting our products in front of them more and in a more relevant way.
Is that more emails, text messages after you've booked, but before you've checked in?
Combination of all those things, right? It's talking about the products on social media. It's doing all kinds of different ways through email. And even coming forward, we're in the process of taking the United.com to a new website that's rolling out now. You can, more than half the time, if you log on, you're going to get it. We're throttling it up as we speak. And that next version of that website is going to also give us expanded ability to put the products more in front of folks in terms of bundles and the purchase path as we move into 2016. So that first category is just, we got lots of great product that we think people value, and we want to get them in front of their eyes and so forth. The second area is that new products. And so the team thinks about things that people will value, and that it becomes a choice that we can then either sell a la carte or bundle it with a couple other things. The third area, which is really where we've been successful this year, is what I call dynamic pricing of our products. So if you took Economy Plus, when we did the merger, we had one price point for Economy Plus. Today we have 16 price points and the ability to expand that.
For everyone in the room, Economy Plus are those coach seats at the front that have, was it 3 to 5 inches of more leg room?
A little bit more pitch, from basically the exit row forward in the aircraft. And so now with dynamic pricing, I can begin to understand what an individual is willing to pay for an aisle seat at this time of day, or a window seat, or a price that's a leisure passenger that's more on a weekend and so forth, that's a little bit more price sensitive. And we're able to kind of match up what people are willing to pay for. So again, it's the ability to offer people more choice in a relevant way, in understanding what people are looking for.
And what you gave us that 3.15 billion number. What does that equate to per passenger? Where are you looking to get?
Yeah, we've only talked publicly about we're trying to get that not 3.15 but 3.5, and by 2017. And so where that average falls out depends on how successful I am at getting in front of more people, versus, because that number is per all in-plane passengers that we carry, whether they use it or not. And so where that average ends up is kind of an unknown right now, other than we think that we're going to grow. We're really on target to hit the numbers in terms of the absolute revenue we're driving.
We're 5 years past the merger with Continental Airlines. United's been through a lot recently. Your CEO and 2 other executives lost their jobs following an internal investigation into the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey and United's role in a corruption scandal there. Your new CEO, Oscar Munoz, has apologized for a spate of issues with the airline, from on-time performance and just being better with customer service. But he hasn't given too many details yet, except that he plans to work with everybody. So let me ask you, if you were running the airline right now, what 3 concrete changes would you do to fix United?
Boy, that's a great question. And I do have a new boss, and so clearly don't want to steal his thunder, as we joked about earlier in that. But I think, but from my perspective, having been here, I think that that we, as an airline, United, the understanding that we're in a service business. We are in a service business, and it's about reliability, and it's about doing what you say you're going to do. And in our business, that means leaving on time and arriving on time, and getting your luggage there and so forth. I think the thing we haven't done a good job, and Oscar is really, really focused on that, you're hearing him talk about it, is that our frontline employees we have the most experienced folks in the industry and the best folks in the industry. They have seen everything, and they really have seen everything over the last 5 years in terms of the stress. And so we haven't met either our employees' expectations of the merger or our customers. And so going forward, one thing that I would change, and again, my new boss isn't going to be any different on this, is that how do you ensure that you're listening and getting the input from both your customers and, quite frankly, the people that deliver your product for you, the employees. And I would say that's an area that in the last 5 years we have not done a good job on, and that's one thing that that's clearly, we're a service business, and we talk about it at United Airlines over the last couple of weeks of how can we be part of something great. And we say be part of something great, we don't just mean Willis Tower, right? We mean all 84,000 employees wanting to be part of something great. So things that I would do, it's not a real specific answer. Oscar's talked about the coffee, so you probably can expect the coffee's going to get better on those airplanes. But at a very much general level, I think that it's getting the involvement in our employees. I learned a long time ago, working in Houston, that much more content, involved employees translates into happy customers. And I think that's one thing that we're going to push as we go forward.
Let's talk a little bit about on-time performance. One of your competitors, Delta, has been promoting its on-time performance. They have buses around the city wrapped talking about it. They now have had more than 100 days this year without a single cancellation of one of their mainline aircraft. How important is that for you to actually get a gate there within 15 minutes of scheduled time, make sure it's not canceled? And is it mechanical problems? Is it scheduling issues? What's been the problem at United?
Yeah, so reliability is super important, right? And we actually internally focus on departure 0 and arrival 0, right? And they're very correlated, the arrival 14 that the DOT measures us on. But we have a huge focus on that departure 0 and arrival 0. It's been, you hit on many of them. Mechanical, we had, in June, a significant number of mechanical issues and that we've resolved and so forth. We're adjusting our scheduling to be more focused to reliability. The network team in January our network will be what we call more out and back. Part of the challenge at United is that we operate in hubs that have significant weather during severe weather times, right? Whether it's the winter and so forth. And we think by doing an out and back, where instead of an aircraft starting in Newark here, going to Orlando, over to Houston, out to LA, what we'll do is have more often the aircraft go back and forth from Orlando to Newark, right? So that when you have severe weather and you have multiple frequencies out of Newark, you won't be canceling flights from Houston to LA that were affected by the weather that you might have had back here. You've all traveled where you're sitting in Houston and the sun's shining, right? And the airline tells you that, sorry, we had to cancel your flight due to weather, and you're like, we've all experienced that, right? And so what we think by becoming more out and back, and we're making that significant change. There's a cost to that. When we talk about that's an investment, right? Because when you do that, you lower the utilization of your aircraft. Airplanes like to be in the air. That's when they generate revenue. By making that investment, though, we think that'll drive higher reliability, particularly in completion. That's an investment we make, going back to your original question, that you are able to do in this time frame. And that we need to do better, right? We need to do better. Our aspiration is to be your carrier of choice. If you're making a travel decision, we want United Airlines on your mind, right? And reliability is a big part of being on someone's mind and so forth.
Let's talk a little bit about the aircraft themselves. Some are brand new planes, fuel efficient, no maintenance problems. Some look like they are out of an 80s movie. They still have ashtrays on them. They're a little beat up around the edges, and they tend to have more mechanical delays. Where are you heading with your fleet? And for the longest time, it was all about new planes, fuel efficiency, but recently you've bought some used 737s from Panama's Copa, A319s from China Southern, and you're even taking those really big 777s that hold 350 people and running them domestically for 2-3 hours. So can I expect new planes, old planes? What will it feel like, and will they break down?
You know, so it's a question that has got a web to it, right? The answer, one is that every day you're seeing less of those airplanes that look like the 80s, because I use I love the Airbus aircraft. We have 150 Airbus 319s and 320s. If you went back 4 years ago, that Airbus aircraft had really, really small bins. You balked out, and you made the boarding process horrible for our agents, because what happens when you balk out, you got to start asking passengers to check their bag, right? It slows down the boarding process. If you walk down the aisle, I had the duck to get under the screen that was sitting in the aisle. That was the IFE, right?
I've never had that problem.
But it was there. Believe me, it was there. You saw it when you sat down. The seats were old, right, and so forth. You get on that aircraft today, all 150 of them, you walk on, there's big bins, right? There is no tube that I hit my head on anymore. I have my iPad, and I open it up, and over 100 movies and TV shows show up on my iPad for free that are being streaming from a server on that aircraft, right? And I want to be connected back to the office. I have Wi-Fi.
Same plane.
Same airplane. It's 4 years older than when it was back in 2011, but it looks brand new with leather seats and looking good. So Scott, the answer is what we want to do is balance our fleet needs with our capital constraints, with the fact that we need to have modern, reliable aircraft, and you can do that even with the used aircraft. We did that with the 767-300. We've been transferring them from 3-class to 2-class internationally, and the satisfaction scores on that aircraft are terrific and so forth. And with that 777 you mentioned, we'll actually reconfigure it to a domestic configuration with as more seats, allows us to fly that aircraft real efficiently, but also upgrade the product in there. And so when you walk on the airplane, it looks and feels like a new airplane. You have to invest. You know, what you do is the tech ops group and our maintenance groups also then invests in the maintenance packages, obviously to extend the life of that, so it's a balance that we have.
We're going to open up to questions in a minute, so if you have your questions, get ready with them. And just make sure to identify yourself before you ask it. But before we do, just want to talk a little bit about pilot shortage in the US. A lot of times you get on a flight, a United Express flight, and it's flown by another airline, one of these regional airlines that you partner with. And they're having a lot of trouble filling the cockpit right now. Republic Airways, for instance, cut 5% the number of flights this year compared to last year, and they're saying in part that's because of pilots. How important is that feed to you for you to reach those small cities that so many people rely on, and how do we get out of this problem?
Yeah, it is a challenge. It's a challenge that's happening today. What Scott's referring to, two things are happening. January 2014, the qualifications to fly, to be a commercial pilot became 1,500 hours of flight time. That was up from 250 hours, so significant change in the requirements. So the number of eligible pilots is not anywhere near it was before that change in 2014. At the other end, it's been about 6 years ago now, but remember the government took the retirement age from 60 to 65 for pilots in the US. So the industry, United, is retiring hundreds of pilots a year at 65. At the same time, the supply of pilots, of eligible pilots, has been squeezed, right? So the mainline carriers don't have any issue. you're a regional pilot and United Airlines comes a-calling, that's a great thing. Wow, I have a career path to fly that 787. And by the way, what's happening at United, because all those retirements, the movement from right seat to left seat, from first officer to captain, is happening at paces that we haven't seen in many, many years. So it's really exciting for, so we have no challenge attracting pilots. But the regional partners are, right? And the regional partners, our classes are full, and they're full with regional. And already today, over the last couple of years, we've had regional partners call and say, we can't fly that schedule that we've contracted to, right? And so we've had to actually, by the end of this year, we have removed 130 equivalent 50-seat regional jets, right? Which, again, it ties, the reason I say the fleet's a web, it ties to your earlier question of that 777 flying in the US domestic, right? Because we have to become more dependent on the main line because of the changing marketplace.
And what does that mean for people out here who might live not in New York or Chicago, but who live in Cheyenne, Wyoming, who rely on those 50-seat jets to get out? Are they going to get 150-seat planes coming in, or are they losing air service completely?
Well, the first pass, what we've been doing is the first pass is that what you'll see in some of those cities is what we call frequency consolidation, right? And so if there were 4 trips, it can consolidate to 2 trips, right? And in the marketplace. But given kind of the numbers, it will put pressure on small cities. And without some type of market adjustment, it wouldn't, I would expect that service to small cities will be affected and to a degree. But to date, we've been able to work with frequency consolidation by consolidating onto a mainline aircraft. 350-seaters to that Airbus is the same number of seats in the market, but you're going to have less frequency.
And how does, if you lose those small cities, someone from Cheyenne can't get to Chicago and connect on to London, how does that affect your bottom line?
Yeah, I think, the connecting, we're a hub and spoke carrier, right? Connecting traffic's really important to us. And being able to feed those mainline flights are really, really important. We'll be smart about it. We'll look, obviously cities have catchment areas. And so there are going to be some areas where people are probably driving more close. Probably not a great example, the one you used. And so it's just kind of a balance there of we're going to, again, my philosophy is we need to, at United, we're going to keep capacity in line with demand. And you got to understand the marketplace. You got to understand what your customer's asking for, what they're willing to pay. You got to deliver on it, but you got to make sure your capacity stays in line with demand, because that's what's been able for us to have the success that you talked about in the beginning.
Let's open it up to questions. I saw over there. Please make sure to identify yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Jim Pensero, Wall Street Journal. First, I have a kind of an observation and then a question. Observation: United Gates in Terminal A in Newark are a dump. And when are you going to bring them up to Terminal C level? But I guess that's a question. But the real question is, United, Delta, American have, brought complaints against the Gulf carriers, Emirates. Do you feel, especially your new CEO, do you really feel that, especially in a political time like this, that you're going to get any relief from Washington on this complaint? Or do you just have to go head-to-head with what is a very, very high-quality competitors?
Yeah, so we've, you're referring to the Delta, United American, Dakota. We've gotten great response in Washington, and actually on the Hill, a great amount of support to it. Again, the issue is, first of all, we're asking the government to just look at what open skies means and have consultations between the U.S. and the governments affected to discuss the issue. Because we've clearly presented evidence that is really, really clear that over, up to $42 billion of subsidies. So the general argument is that you got to have a level playing field. We referred to it in in regards to trade, and so that level playing field hasn't been there to bring the Middle Eastern carriers the number of seats. The data would say there's been no stimulation of traffic, and yet very much subsidized and so forth. And every time, the reason I mentioned jobs is that every time a Middle Eastern carrier flies to the U.S., it's hundreds of jobs that are lost in the U.S. because of that. We're all for competition. This is a really competitive business, right? It's extremely competitive. We compete with low-cost carriers across the U.S. system, ultra-low-cost carriers. We compete with international carriers. But it can't compete on an unlevel playing field. And that's what we're raising the issue. We have really great evidence that supports that. And we're asking the government to respond to that. And we expect that response to be coming.
And do you think they'll be sympathetic to your case? I mean, they've got a lot of things going on right now, and they've taken meetings, but not come out supporting your side.
The evidence is really, really clear, is what I would say, is that the evidence is really clear and we'll see what the results of that are. But the evidence is really, really clear that the subsidies have really created a very uneven level playing field.
Andrew Leckie, Reynolds National Center for Business Journalism at Arizona State University. Now, having taken those flights to China many times and being based in Chicago, and I have talked to so many United employees over extended hours, what realistically can you do to improve the esprit de corps? Because as far back as I can remember, you've had disgruntled employees way before your time there. What are some specific things you can do to make them happier in their jobs?
Yeah, a great question. And real specific right out of the bat is we got 2 open contracts. Let's get them done, right? So with our technicians, the IBT, and with our flight attendants, they've gone without a joint collective bargain agreement since the merger. We need to get those done. So that the great thing about culture is having a single culture, not a divided culture that's continental or united and so forth. And so part of getting to that point is to getting those contracts done. And I know Oscar is really, really focused on that. And as a matter of fact, is bringing the union leadership together this month to talk about what they feel can be done. Basically, get their input on the question that you asked, right? I get a chance to talk to lots of employees. I was with a new captain class yesterday, and the real things we can do is engage with employees. It's amazing spending an hour with captains and they only ask questions about the business. They're really interested in on the main line why there's regional jets behind them or in front of them, right? But when you talk about what Scott mentioned earlier, the ability to connect into the traffic and allow us to have a robust mainline fleet. So part of it is you got to engage. You got to have that engagement, and we didn't have it enough, right? And employees have to be part of the process and have their input. And so what Oscar's going to do is act also on their input. You can agree to disagree, but you got to also tell them, you have to talk, tell people why you don't. So there's one, get the contracts done. One is recognize that we all need to make this great. We have the best network. It's fun to be the only airline at a conference, but I would say that even if my colleagues at other airlines were here, there's no other network that's more powerful. We do have to invest in Terminal A at Newark, and we need to get that cleaned up. But Newark is the gem in New York. It's the only true connecting hub in New York, right? And so from a revenue perspective, I can do all kinds of different things. I always like to, it's a long connection between JFK and LaGuardia, right? And so we have all kinds of things that we can do that. And so this network's amazing. My enthusiasm is in the employees, they know it, and they want to be a part of it.
Jim, you mentioned contracts. You guys just hinted or said that you would order 100-seat planes if pilots agreed to open up the contract earlier. You're basically dangling a carrot out there for them. Can you talk a little bit about that strategy there?
Yeah, and so you're so much more direct, right? It's always on. We have a scope agreement with our pilots. Just put in perspective. that we can fly X number of aircraft, 250 to 70-seat regional jets on regional carriers. Anything above that 76-seat limit, have to be flown by the main line, right? And so the economics of the cost structure of a mainline carrier, whether it's carrying parts, whether it's maintaining it, whether it's the cost of labor, are always very high when you have smaller seats. But in our current agreement, we have an agreement that if, to bring in basically 100-seat airplanes, right? And so I think one of the things, when I talk about things that we can do with labor, it's not just the 2 contracts that we have open, but we're talking about an early opening with the pilots and so forth, and finding a way that we can do that, make it win-win, and bring in potentially a fleet that allows us to match demand and capacity better, markets that need 100-seat type aircraft.
We've got time for one more question. James?
James Medora, right about the economy for Newsday. If Newark's the gem, let's talk about LaGuardia and JFK. New York State is spending a lot of money to try to improve both of these airports. What do you think about the plans, and what is United Airlines' role in making LaGuardia no longer third world and improve JFK?
Yeah, great. My general philosophy on airport investment is that we need investment in infrastructure across our country needs to be done, right? I remember I was on a panel at Northwestern University, and it was on infrastructure, and I followed roads, rail, bridges, and then it was air. And I think I got up there and there was no money left to get you to the airport. The infrastructure of our country needs tremendous investment in. The question, and so we do need it in the airports, and the question is, how do you do, that investment needs to be efficient, right? It's about creating efficiency in the new world of security, in the new world of the type of aircraft, the type of fleet. How do we make that investment so that, one, it's very efficient, and it's delivering the results that we need, so that it doesn't get labeled as you mentioned, a third world type airport and so forth. And so our role, our corporate real estate, is we work really, really closely with the Port Authority. And we work really, really closely with other airports. Denver is a great example. We fly Denver-Tokyo on a 787, partly because the mayor of Denver and the airport's folks at Denver worked with us to reduce costs. We became more efficient in Denver, and were able to make a flight that otherwise wouldn't have worked for us work. And so it's that relationship of working with each other, and so we'll be very much involved with the port in terms of what happens both at LaGuardia, and then obviously with the port with Newark.
And the Port Authority has some of the highest fees for airlines in the country.
And that's why when you think about investments, you got to think about how are they done in a cost-effective way, right? Because we start from a high-cost basis already here.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time and giving us some insights. We really appreciate it. I think enlightening for everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
A quick housekeeping note, lunch in the other room, boxed lunch. You can eat in the newsroom, bring it back here at 12:15. We're going to get started again. We got a whole...
Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. We are here now to do the panel on investigative journalism, and we've got a great panel here of 3 people who have done some award-winning stories that look at some very interesting issues in reporting in the business context. So let me introduce them first. I guess I should introduce myself for those of you who weren't here last night. I run the McGraw Center for Business Journalism here at CUNY. We do a number of things, but one of the main programs we run, if you've seen these cards floating around, is the McGraw Fellowship for Business Journalism. We provide grants and editorial support for investigative and enterprise, basically long-form business and economic stories of the sort that a lot of people have trouble doing these days, both for time and money reasons. So we have another call for proposals coming up November 15th. We do it twice a year, so if you or anyone you know has a good proposal that needs funding, please get in touch. You can go to our site, and there's lots of information along with the postcards that are floating around here. So there's my advertisement, and now we'll move on to our panel. So first, on the far side is Eric Lipton of the New York Times. He's a Washington-based correspondent there where he writes about government relations, corporate agendas, and Congress. And in 2015, he won the Pulitzer Prize for Investigative Journalism for a series of stories that he did looking at the explosion of lobbying of the state attorney generals by corporate interests. And that is, I might add, his second Pulitzer. The first he won before coming to the Times back in 1999 with the Hartford Courant, where he won a Pulitzer in explanatory journalism for a series of stories he co-wrote on the flaws in the Hubble Space Telescope. And he's also an author, co-author with James Glanz of City in the Sky, The Rise and Fall of the World Trade Center, which looked at a history of the towers through their destruction, construction, life, and unfortunate destruction. So welcome. Next to him is Beth Daly. She is a senior reporter at the New England Center for Investigative Reporting, where she covers the environment, science, and education. She won a SABEW Best in Business Award this year, and also first place honors in investigative reporting from the Association of Healthcare Journalists for a story that she wrote at the end of last year called Oversold and Misunderstood, which looked at the problems with unregulated genetic diagnostic tests that are increasingly being used in prenatal screening and other areas. And as a result of that work, we actually awarded her one of the McGraw Fellowships for Business Journalism, and she's just published this past Sunday a really great new piece looking at the problems with those kinds of tests as they're being used and possibly misused in psychiatric care. And she was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist in 2008 for a series of stories examining the impact of climate change in New England, and a 2011 Knight Fellow at Stanford. You're welcome. And Greg, next to me here, is also an investigative reporter in Washington on the national staff of McClatchy. He and his colleagues won a SABEW Best in Business Award this year as well for a series of articles that showed how a single company, Motorola Solutions, has been able to control more than 80% of the public safety emergency communications market, which added hundreds of millions of dollars to taxpayer costs by selling this equipment at what appears to be, from your stories, highly inflated prices. He was also in 2010 part of a team that won a Loeb Award for business reporting and was named as a Pulitzer Prize finalist for a four-part series they did for McClatchy examining Goldman Sachs' role in the collapse of the mortgage securities market and the financial crisis. So welcome to you as well. So what I wanted to do is just, we're going to talk through those stories and talk a little bit about how they did them and whatnot. We'll talk for about maybe half hour, 40 minutes, and then open it up for questions. So the first question is just the obvious one, which is, in doing these stories, how did you get started? If you can talk a little bit about kind of where the idea came from, how you got started on it, and kind of approach the story. So Eric, why don't you go ahead and start?
Sure. Well, the piece on the state attorneys general started with a tip, which we received at the New York Times from a lobbyist in Washington. And this lobbyist had been approached by the Republican Attorneys General Association, and she represents some major food companies. And she had been approached and asked to contribute as much as $125,000 to get special access to state attorneys general. Companies, at the same time as she was representing companies that were potentially going to be a target of investigations. And so, those kinds of requests for money in exchange for access happen all the time in politics, but these are men and women who have subpoena power, and they're the top law enforcement officers in their states. So if you were, in exchange for $125,000, going to be given the right to spend a resort weekend with them and to have special briefings and away from the 9 prosecutors involved in those investigations, this was a pretty incredible incentive, and it seemed wrong. So that document alone that we got could have been a front page story. You could just have written the daily story off of that, not spent a couple of days and written a story. But my boss and I decided that we really wanted to understand who were the companies, who were the AGs, what were the issues, and how was justice being impaired as a result of this relationship between the donors and the recipients. And so that became the start of an 8-month project. We didn't write a single word about that until 8 months later. And it emerged as a 3-part series examining how corporations were able to change the outcomes of investigations, and also how they were able to solicit the help of state attorneys general as part 2 of the series to lobby Washington to stop environmental regulations, and part 3 of the series about how they were able to team up with state attorneys general to sue corporations with private law firms that were going to get as much as 25% of the $100 million or so that they would get in awards as a commission for that work. And so it was an investigation that involved lots of documents and lots of traveling and lots of interviews. But it all started with this one tip, which we said, what's the story behind the story, instead of just writing the daily.
Great. Beth, you want to talk about yours?
Everyone hear me okay? So mine started actually kind of oddly. I wrote my last year at the Globe, I wrote a series about Lyme disease. I was the environment reporter there for probably over 10 years on and off. And I wrote a story about Lyme disease, which, believe it or not, is a very controversial issue in New England and elsewhere, highly controversial. And in the course of doing so, I did one story on the tests for Lyme disease. And I discovered this really interesting thing. I just wrote a quick story about it, that there are a lot of labs offering tests to the general public that claimed great predictive power in diagnosing Lyme disease. But it was pretty clear, looking at the science behind it, that was probably not the case from what I could discern. So I wrote a story about this, but honestly, it wasn't a tip as much as I just got thinking about it, and every now and then I'd be out for a run and say, that's so weird. You can actually just have a test and not have any regulatory authority look at a test that's being offered to the public. It's not true for drugs, right? But a test is really important. It determines so many different things. So I just sort of tucked it away in the back of my head, like I often do, and started, late at night reading up on the FDA, because I never had covered medicine before. And what quickly emerged was was clearly a big debate in Washington, although a quiet one, about clinical labs particularly genetic clinical labs, were exploiting a loophole the FDA first put into place about more than 3 decades ago that said, and it literally says this, if you are a clinical laboratory and you develop, manufacture, and conduct a test in a single building, that's the definition, a single building, you don't have to go before the FDA to prove that your test actually is accurate or safe. And it's true. And I was stunned to learn of this and didn't see a lot on it. I think there was an editorial in the New York Times once, and I just was sort of, I couldn't quite believe it, because it doesn't seem like it should happen, or if it does happen, I'd like to see the fact that there's some assurance to the public that the tests are good. And it led me very quickly to a story about one of the most popular genetic tests last year, which was prenatal genetic tests. It's going to predicted to be a $4 billion industry in 5 years, where you can now take a blood test at 9 weeks and determine if your child, it's a screening test, your child will have Down syndrome, or really, more importantly, a whole list of other chromosomal abnormalities that are really incompatible with life, that most people presented with those findings might say, I choose not to go forward with this pregnancy. But it was very clear, not to get too deep into the statistics, the companies, because they didn't have to go through any authority, were using one statistic, saying that the tests were 99% accurate, and using words like near diagnostic. And the salespeople from the companies were going to the doctor's office and telling them this. And the doctors who don't understand genetics would then believe this 99% statistic. And in fact, it was completely untrue. The tests were only screening. A lot of doctors didn't understand that. The tests were not 99% accurate. They were actually, if you got a positive test result back, it was only less than 50% accurate. And so I discovered a lot of women aborting, well, not a lot, I found some instances of women aborting healthy fetuses. And that has since taken me down another path, which Jane was wonderful enough to fund in McGraw, looking more closely at these genetic tests. I looked at, very quickly, one on psychiatric genetic tests that will tell you if you suffer from depression or schizophrenia, what drugs are best for you. It's a very promising field. It's possible and likely that we'll have a world one day where we'll use these tests. But right now, the science behind them is very flimsy. And most of them are getting in front of patients through things that look very much like conflict of interest. kickbacks to doctors, paying doctors to order the tests, that sort of thing. So yeah, so and now I'm embarking on 5 other stories based on Jane's. So that's clear.
As they always do, one path leads to 5 others. Greg, talk a little bit about how you came up with your stories.
You know, there's a funny thing how stories get started. It was about 2009. One of my colleagues pulled me over to his desk one day and pointed at a stack of documents and said, "We got it. We got to talk. I got a great stuff here about Motorola and emergency communications." But we were both doing other things. I was actually doing Goldman Sachs at the time, and that landed in the circular file, all those documents and that tip. But as it happened in 2011, we had that summer a very precocious student intern named Lydia Mulvaney who had been on a path for a doctorate and decided that somehow figured out that she'd be more interested in journalism than getting a doctorate. So she started looking at a push in Congress to shell out $7 billion in tax money to finance a new broadband network for public safety agencies across the country. And something clicked, and I remembered that tip. So I sort of started coaching her as she was immersing herself in this story, just to do some dailies, really. And we ended up spending a lot of time that summer at night, even. And she was a real, hard crunching student intern. And of course, we had another one that broke the Senate CIA story but 2 years ago. So we've had some great interns, and Lydia was among the best. And so but as internships go, her time came and went, and I had to take it over. We did do one story where we actually wrote about dead bodies, where Motorola, the lead company in that emergency communications industry for public safety agencies in particular, had been making the switch from analog to digital radios, and firefighters would be in the basement, say, of a building with steel and concrete walls, and would put out a Mayday call, and it never got where it had to go. Kind of rings back to 9/11, when the firefighters were in the building and the police helicopter said, up high, said, "Get everybody out of the building," and the police department heard it, but the fire department didn't. So I'll talk more later. Thanks.
Okay. So these are my stories that by definition are hard to get to develop once you've got the idea, or you sense that there's something there. Can you talk a little bit about, and also just in reading your stories, each of you in different ways has used massive amounts of data and other sourcing, a lot of, I think, Greg, you and Eric particularly, a lot of public records. Beth, yours seem to be more based on kind of medical literature than public records. So can you talk now a little bit about, you've got the idea, you kind of have a vague sense of where it is, but it's behind places that you don't have access to. How do you think about and structure your reporting and start going out to try to do the things you need to do to get at the story? Beth, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like anything else. You look for the public records first. So I had and I'm still trying to familiarize myself with Medicare data, which is like this, it's an octopus with 7 heads, to try to understand some of the patterns of cost and whatnot. And I'm actually still working through that, so I haven't quite cracked that yet. But I often, honestly, I go to someone to get someone on my side to tell me something. So I was no longer with the Boston Globe, which gave me nothing like, it gave me a little bit of clout, outside of Boston, but not much. And now I work for this non-entity called the New England Center for Investigative Reporting that no one had ever heard of. So I just called the FDA PR person on a cold call and said, can I come down and talk to the head of, your device lab? And they laughed and didn't respond for many weeks. But I was persistent and basically, finally just said, oh, I'm coming to Washington, and I stopped by for 10 minutes off the record. And so I developed sort of credibility there and through other places, and through a set of circumstances, that I can tell you about. Like, I got in touch with some people who knew where in the genetic world I needed to look to write a story about impact in genetic testing and the lack of regulation. And they were very helpful in saying, you know, genetic testing is this gigantic, 15,000 genetic tests on the market. I could pick any of them and look at the science behind them. It would take me so long. But choosing the right one that actually is having real life impact was really was hard. So I relied on someone to give me a tip, and then I did it on my own. I looked through PubMed. I spent weeks just reading scientific literature. I know statistics a little bit, but I don't know it great. So like I had to really teach myself and go through it, and then ask for a lot of help along the way. So
Teach yourself a lot about what some of the stuff in the literature
you know,
meant.
what these terms that you never hear, positive predictive value, and so, you know, like these
what that
things that
means.
like
Kidding.
but and then ask for a lot of help from statisticians to understand exactly where the problem was. So it really wasn't public records, but it was a lot of medical records, and really going down deep into some of these publications.
In other words, it was publicly available things, but things you'd have to know to really go
To look for,
where
yeah,
to
it's not
look
something
for.
people would find
Yeah.
normally.
Yeah, and Eric, your piece, you mentioned 6,000 emails between the state attorneys general and the lobbyists. I assume you got those through a FOIA request?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we all have in common is when you listen to the discussions of the stories, is that it's all three of them are the stories behind the stories. You know, so you have this, you know, the Motorola controls the market, this test that, you know, there's a question about, you know, the wonder about the accuracy and the regulation, and, you know, and then I have money and attorneys general. And so, I mean, you know, the immediate question is, well, how do you go and sort of like get a picture into this world and, you know, figure out your way to get behind that story, and then to find the characters, you know, find the events and find the documents, and then find a narrative that lets you then illustrate these characters and these events. And so you're just sort of rolling backwards and constructing this story. And you're not making presumptions about what the story is going to be yet, because the story is developing in front of you, and you know, you're not trying to judge it. And that's one of the things I've learned as I've been doing more and more reporting, is sort of waiting for the story to become clear to me, and you know, trying not to get too fixated on exactly. I know there's a story there, but you know, let it emerge.
How long sometimes does it take in this process?
So in this case, you know, again, the first thing I did was I unannounced went to one of these Republican Attorneys General and Democratic Attorneys General events, which I wasn't. It's a closed event. I just put on a suit and a tie, and I went. And you know, I sort of walked in like this, so where the badge would be, my arms were just sort of across my chest. And you know, the New York Times rules are that you're allowed to go to any event you want, but if you're asked who you are, you have to identify yourself. And if they ask you to leave, you leave. But we're allowed to go where we want. So I went to those events, and I listened, and I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't make eye contact with anyone, because if I did, they would introduce themselves, and then I'd have to introduce myself. And I grabbed a copy of the program. The program was the most golden gift that I got there, because there was a list of every person there, their email addresses, all the corporations they were working for, all the donors. And I just eavesdropped for 2 days. I actually participated for 2 days in these conferences.
Before they kicked you out, I think
and
they said.
No, and in fact, they had no idea who I was, and no one observed that I was there, and no one had any idea I was there during the whole time. And I left with an incredible, you know, collection of basically leads as to who were the characters, what were the companies, who were the big donors, and what were their email addresses. The email addresses became the roadmap for my open records request. Because then I took the email addresses and I cross-referenced them with the corporations, and I submitted open records requests to 25 states for correspondence between those specific email addresses and the top people in the Attorney General's offices, and in a specific period of time. So it was a very narrow request for just those people and just the top people at the AG's offices. And I used the fact that the AGs in most states are the open records officers, so therefore they enforce the law across the states and with all the other state agencies, and they're constantly giving talks about how important it is of visibility in government. And I turned that little irony on them and made sure that they were going to then turn over all these email correspondences that they had never before been asked to show their own email correspondences. And I ended up getting, in fact, it was 6 and it was 10. It was like almost like more than 10,000 pages worth of emails from all these different states. And I threaded them together And and the thing that was so fascinating was that it became a conversation that I was essentially listening to that went through all these different states. Because through a single state, you couldn't get the visibility because the same lobbyists are working in different states and they were seeing each other. And it was only through all those conversations that the stories began to emerge. And there was some, it was incredible stuff, and it was scandalous, some of the stuff, and it was through, then I developed the characters, I continued to go to other resort events, until finally I was basically outed, and the police escorted me from the beach villas at the Del and at the Hotel Del Coronado in California, once the Republican Attorney Generals finally figured out who I was and what I was doing there. And by that point, I already had all my characters figured out. We'd actually even had a photographer on the beach taking photos of them playing volleyball with the lobbyist, and we had the open records request coming in, and we started writing our stories at that point. So, but at that point we had full visibility. We had the characters, we had the companies, and the emails gave us the conversations, and you thread all that together, and it became an incredible narrative.
So in other words, the request you made it was only the people on those emails as opposed to a broader request. But
it wasn't like, give me everything on natural gas and fracking.
Yeah.
No, it was just Devon Energy, this lobbyist, because they were the lobbyists that were going to these events.
Yeah.
And sometimes I asked for anyone from Devon, for example, because I knew Devon was a big player. And other times I asked just for that specific lobbyist. And I actually mostly focused on the former attorney generals who had become lobbyists, because they were like the brokers to many of these corporations. And so you got their email correspondence, and all of a sudden you had like 20 corporations, because they were brokering so many conversations for these others. And so you would never have the visibility into their conversations unless you had their emails, because they were never going to tell me what they were really saying. So you needed to both know the characters, know who was contributing the money, and then get their emails, because that's the way you got the real visibility.
Okay, that's great. I want to come back to how you tied them all together, but first, Greg, if you can talk a little bit about, it's a great story.
And I love the way you tailored your public records request so that you wouldn't lose many more months while they were gathering the chaff. You asked for the wheat.
Yeah.
You got it. That's really terrific. We began to sort of network early on, and we called competing companies Motorola rivals who had been basically, tossed out of the game for all intents and purposes, not only by Motorola's tactics, but also, as we quickly began to learn, by very sympathetic government officials. And that really became a lot of our focus, because you have to expect a company to try to garner as much business as it can. But if people in the government have somehow become co-opted, then the playing field's not level at all. It's not particularly level. And first of all, though, we had to immerse ourselves. Each of us had to kind of learn the language of the story. And I loved also your comment about letting the story emerge, because as we were groping around trying to understand what a megahertz and a kilohertz is, and analog and digital, and I don't know what it is about me, but I tend to gravitate towards complex stories that are too hard for me. And so this one it took me a long time to kind of absorb this. And we also were getting some pretty fascinating tips. So ultimately, I ended up, when I look back on it, doing 5 investigations at the same time. And one of the things I did before I go into that was when Lydia was still helping me, we began to survey, because we wanted data. And it became clear early on that nobody, even in the government, even at the Congressional Research Service, which was asked to do it, nobody knew where all the business was for this company. And this is something, I guess we'll talk about takeaways at the end, but that's so important, is that if you can figure out how to gather data, it gives your story so much more power. So we surveyed the top 20 cities, the 20 largest cities in the country. Problem is, first we asked them to answer a survey, got very few responses, I think maybe 2 or 3. Then we started filing public records requests, and this story went on for 2 years. And I worked on other things. I even did another project or two and worked on the campaign financing for the presidential campaign, and then finally said, okay, this is all we're going to get out of this survey. But these cities were, it was like you're asking for police departments and fire departments and sheriff's departments to just give you their emergency communications contract. New York City told us that it could not locate the police department's emergency communications contract with Motorola.
But you did end up, I think you had a figure, it was quite phenomenal.
19 out of the 20 cities had Motorola. 19 out of the 20.
The number of contracts you got, I think I wrote it down, it was like 1,000 or more. Maybe but how did you end up getting some of the contracts when they were reluctant to give it to you?
Well,
did you have to go through FOIA?
We got public records requests.
Yeah.
And when, you're starting to learn, you're letting the story emerge again. You're finding out that in the Houston-Galveston area, they issued what they call a cooperative contract. And this is a device that can be very good for governments, because if somebody, one big jurisdiction issues a contract and allows other agencies to use their competitively awarded contract, say you're a small town of, say, 30,000 people and you want to have some competition for emergency communications, you can't afford to run that procurement, especially because if Motorola loses, they're going to sue, they're going to fight. You hear that microphone? And so what happened was that we found Fort Worth and Washington, D.C. used the cooperative contract issued by the Houston-Galveston area to award their emergency communications business, like $50 million contracts, and they wouldn't even run a procurement. It would have been fine if maybe a suburb of Houston did that, but it just struck us as very odd. And then what was ironic about it is that Fort Worth, they managed to wring some additional discounts out of Motorola, but Washington, D.C., they just embraced the figures that were, the dollar figures that were in the Houston-Galveston contract. And so those figures were basically full pricing, as I was told by various sources. And the second thing, just quickly, is I ended up chasing some allegations in 5 different places: Eastern part of San Francisco Bay, Los Angeles, Mississippi, Kansas, and a 5th one that escapes me. And there were all kinds of shenanigans going on. Former Motorola marketing executives were suddenly running the award of federal grant dollars. We had in Kansas a contract awarded that they called a competitive contract, and all they did was issue a contract modification on a 1991 contract and award a $50 million statewide contract 15, 14 years later.
So this information came primarily out of the contracts, right?
Interviews, and getting public records data, and also developing sources who were starting to tell us where the bodies were buried.
Okay. Yeah, and that was actually the next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, was how you go about developing sources, particularly people who are reluctant to talk. Beth, I think your story, because 2 types of that source that I know, you and I have talked a lot about, but I think is typical in these kinds of stories. One are the sources that you really need to tell you what's going on, even if it's not necessarily in their best interest to. And then finding the people and the anecdotes, in the case of your stories, some of the patients, that can humanize the stories and make it clear this isn't just about, a bunch of arbitrary tests, but this is about real potential harm to people who are doing this. So can you talk a little bit about both sides?
So it sort of speaks to what Eric was speaking about, right? You need, you have science or data, right? I mean, here, and then you have to weave it in with anecdote to make it a powerful story, and many other things. But and for these 2 stories, I mean, we're talking high stakes here. Like, I had reached out, so I knew this was happening. And I needed to find a woman who was willing to tell her story on the record that she either had an abortion or almost had an abortion, based on these tests, the sort of misrepresentation of the accuracy of these tests. And let me tell you, not a lot of women want to talk publicly about this sort of thing. So first of all, it was even hard to find women where it was proven that this had happened. Most people who have abortions do not test the fetal matter afterwards unless they're planning to have like another child and they're looking for some sort of genetic defect, right? So I kind of knew that in my head, so I went to like the medical schools, and at Stanford, and actually in Boston, I found, I was not able to use it on the record, but I found authority there that this was happening. Stanford, they were willing to tell me there were 3 women they had found that had done this. So that was sort of a data point at least, and I specifically called like every medical center who deals with OBGYN issues, hoping to find.
How many calls did you have to do to make that to get down to?
I called 50. I think I had a 50 on my list, and I think I hit that, maybe 40, 48.
In order to get 1 or 2 examples in the story.
I mean, that's really a powerful statistic when you have an example from a authority.
No, that's my point.
Right,
You have to do a lot of work to get what seems like a simple anecdote in the
Stanford,
end.
because of HIPAA and other places, well, Stanford mostly, because that was like they refused, despite numerous conversations, going out there to try to contact those women. Absolutely refused, even though the doctor wanted me to and everyone else. Okay, so that was a dead end after a while. So, but then I had to reach women. And so what I did, again, I made over, I usually try to have targets of calls I'm trying to make to feel like I have a fair representation of everything. So like, I think I called 75 hospitals. And I really focused it in Boston because the story I knew was going to be picked up by the Globe. And I called every head of OBGYN in hospitals saying, have you come up with these new, these new tests are happening. I'm sure they're in your hospital. Yes, they are. Have you had any false positives? I mean, false positives. No, we haven't. No, we haven't. But at Mass General, I told the guy what I was working on, and he remembered me a month later. He said, yeah, I have this perfect woman. And he gave me her, and we talked. She was going to go on the record. She pulled out after 2 months. She worried about how people would view her because she had scheduled an abortion. And then I blasted, Facebook baby forums, every single baby center forum. I posted, have you had these new tests? I just want to know about your experience. And through that, I found a woman, and I had to have geographically someone local in New England, unfortunately, because I did find some people far away. I found this wonderfully brave woman who was willing to talk about it because she was so horrified. She was 42, had wanted to be pregnant her whole life, had gotten pregnant. They told her her child would not have Down syndrome, would have this horrific genetic defect called trisomy 18, which is, if you're born, 90% are dead by the first week. All of them are dead, like mostly by the first month. And he had scheduled an abortion. And through a set of circumstances that are too probably boring to go into, she did it. But she was willing to go public with it. So that was really hard. But harder still was getting someone with a severe mental illness to go on the record, which took me.
In this latest story,
took me a very long time to find someone. And it wasn't, the stakes weren't even as high. But the stigma around that, I would argue, is even greater than the abortion one.
And I know because I was on the other side of those calls. That took months to find it. But they both, make tremendous leads for both of the stories.
But when you have that
science,
when you have that image, it's the most important thing, to launch the data and everything else.
Eric, your stories, you have some just amazing anecdotal moments too, and I suspect those came from when you were eavesdropping, before they were listening. There was that great quote where you heard some lobbyist asking some attorney general, at breakfast, what are you doing today? And she said, I'm going sailing. And he said, great, I'm going sailing too. Or maybe it was skiing. I get them confused. And then the other thing, you were in the room with Kelly Ayotte after skiing, talking to them all. Talk a little bit about those and if other, where it wasn't just your eavesdropping, other, how you developed some of the other sources when you did actually have to tell them what you were up to and get them to talk to you.
I mean, one of the things that that I do a lot is I will have pretty early interviews with people, and now it depends on the circumstances. But I mean, in this case, like the lawyers and the corporations, and I have to be careful with how I describe this, but I mean, one of the great things is that companies and lawyers love to boast. They love to boast about how great they are, how smart they are, how much they've accomplished, what they're doing for their shareholders or for their clients. And to some extent, I was writing about the world of state attorneys general and about how the stakes are really high and corporations are being sued. And billions of dollars post the tobacco settlement, the biggest settlement ever, and all the pharmaceutical companies, the banks had all been pursued. So I went in and was just early on was talking to some of these lawyer lobbyists about their work. And I was just, talking to them about this profession of, engaging with the state attorneys general. And I was really just letting, and they were, they were thinking, this is great. This is going to be a great story about how I'm helping these corporations.
Brilliant at helping these guys.
Helping these corporations defend their interests. And I was like, yeah, wow, that's fascinating. Damn, you guys are doing some, I mean, I wasn't like, but I was just letting them boast. And I wasn't asking them any hard questions. And nothing about, campaign contributions. This was a very early stage. I mean, I was going to go back to all these same people. But that was very helpful for a bunch of reasons in terms of relationship building, in terms of anecdotal collection of information that in the later interviews they never were going to tell me, and really mostly because of relationship building, because they were going to become some of my characters, and I was in their offices talking to them and collecting all kinds of color on just their whole existence, and so. I just think that when people are in a boasting mode, they tell you things that they will never tell you in a kind of like when you're drilling them.
Yeah.
And so, those early interviews can be really helpful. And you have to be careful to not be deceptive in terms of why you're there, and not misleading in why you're there. But at the same time, it's fine to have an early interview, except with people that you don't want them to know you're working on at all. So you have to pick those carefully. Another thing I think that's important that all of us have talked about is just how important it is to be incredibly organized. You're collecting all these records, all these characters, I mean, I have my computer, which folders, it's like everything is in its own folder, subfolders and subfolders and subfolders and subfolders and subfolders. Everything's organized. Another thing I do is documents. There's this little trick that is that the year _ month _ date, and then the description of what's in the document. And then when you do that, the documents will automatically be sorted in chronological order in your folder. And so you basically have a automatic chronology of all your documents, the date and what they're about. So when you then go back and you've got 6,000 pages of documents, you've got them in chronological order by subject matter and description, in your folder and in your subfolder and your subfolder, your subfolder. And the other thing is that you have to know more than almost the person you're going to interview knows before you get in the room. And getting people to talk to you is all about them thinking that A, you know the subject really well, and B, they better participate because otherwise they're going to come. They may not come out looking very well because they better share their information with you because you know enough that you could actually end up hurting them. When you're getting to a later stage of the interview, and that they actually want to get their side. Make sure that it's fully explained. And so, I mean, I was literally doing an interview last night. I showed up for a story that's running on Monday at a house of someone who didn't know I was coming, and waited until he got home. He's a government official, and I watched him go into his house. He turns on his lights in his house. I'm sitting outside in the car, and this is a classic little stakeout moment. And this is in Northern Virginia last night. I drove out there, went through all the traffic to get out to this guy's house. I figured he'd be home around 6:30. I wanted to get there before it got dark. So I never do these kind of interviews after it's dark because people open the door and it's dark and they freak out immediately. And he opened the door and he immediately said, no, he's not going to talk to me. And I started to explain, everything that I knew in the 30 seconds before he closed the door in my face. And he was like, wait a minute, I actually better talk to this guy.
That makes people realize they better talk to you.
And I also told them, I'm not going to mention your name. I'm not going to mention who you work for. I just need to listen to what you know. And then we talked for 45 minutes. I stood outside, and he closed the door because the mosquitoes are flying into his house. And we talked for 45 minutes. He talked you through the door? He wouldn't let me in his house, which is fine. I didn't want to go in his house. I just stood on his front stoop, and we talked for 45 minutes. And I learned a lot, and that, So anyway, I guess, it's just that those are some, you need to know your subject matter, and as much as the person you're interviewing, if you're going to get someone to talk that doesn't want to talk, that's really important.
Greg, can you talk a little bit about I'm glad you brought the point up about organization, because that was really the next question I wanted to get to in terms of, yes, you've got all this information, and before you start writing, and you're reporting for months, and all of you wrote numerous pieces in your series. So how, as you're going along, do you organize your stuff?
I'm not the king of organization, but I do try hard for example, I had a Motorola Mississippi notes file, and I had a Motorola Los Angeles notes file, and so forth. And then we had many other folders. That was very important, and the relationships also were crucial. And I have to say, I'll always feel frustrated that I didn't get even more, because we had some pretty salacious leads about stuff that would have been criminal, and we all hear this all the time, and we don't get it all. And it's frustrating because we're trying to do the work of criminal investigators without all their tools like subpoenas and things like that. So we were able, and it's funny sometimes when you write stories like these, what happens afterwards can be as important as what happened before, because when we put the stories out in March of 2014, there were 9 stories originally that we put out, and there was an outpouring, not from readers, regular old readers, but from rivals and would-be rivals, other companies I hadn't heard of, calling, and it was, and all kinds of additional information came pouring over the transom. So it's kind of a funny business we're in, because sometimes it's almost like you'd be better off if you get a couple stories out there early, but you're always worrying that maybe Eric Lipton of the New York Times will get onto the story and take it away from you. But this is all these things are considerations, well, maybe I should stop there. You want me to save my other takeaways for now, or?
Yeah. Well, one question I had with any of you is, what you've talked about is obviously gathering lots of records, but in the organization where you're thinking, sort of traditional methods of sorting through and organizing the data. Do any of you use? Have you done more? Use software, other filtering tools, or data analysis tools to go through the stuff? You talked a little bit about the the email, sort of sorting through and collating the email across the states. What have you used to do that?
So just an organization, yeah. Well, just quickly. So I keep things organized in my computer, but as things become more clear, right, as a story, I start actually printing out the documents that are most salient, and not all the documents to the story that sort of tell the story that I can actually physically hold. It's very I don't know why, it's very helpful for me, and that's always there. Yeah, so I use Excel a lot. I write on 2 big subjects now. One is sea level rise and insurance, and one is genetics. So I'm always kind of toggling back and forth. So I just keep Excel spreadsheets on data requests I get on the FEMA stuff, and and then for genetic testing, what works, what doesn't. I use Microsoft Access when I'm trying to join databases occasionally to try to see stuff, which has been helpful for some of the insurance stuff so far for data dumps. But that's about it.
I think that this is old-fashioned chronologies are so important to stories, and to help you see what your story is. And almost every investigative thing I'm working on, I will build a chronology, and I will continue to fill that chronology in. And again, the chronology is the kind of thing that just speaks to you. The narrative of time is so powerful, and it's such a great storytelling vehicle that you're just building. You can see relationships between different things that you didn't realize existed, by letting the chronology kind of emerge. And so I think that just keeping a good chronology of whatever the topic is that you're working on and filling it in as you get new documents and new data points, new statements, and you look at the relation. Like, for example, when I was working on the first part of the series in the Attorney General story, and this Missouri Attorney General was negotiating a settlement with Pfizer over the fraud and mislabeling of a drug. And I was looking at the emails, and I was seeing that they were inviting the Deputy Attorney General. They asked the Deputy Attorney General to see whether or not the AG could come to Chicago to give a talk to their political action committee. And this guy was already planning on running for governor. And so I was looking at these emails, and I was like, that's sort of odd. Here they are, and they're inviting this sitting attorney. And then I compared the dates to that to the settlement talks. And I saw that in the same week that they were negotiating final settlement on this lawsuit, they invited, through the deputy, the Attorney General to fly to Chicago to give a talk. And that was like, wow, holy shit, look at that correlation. And then I took the settlement numbers and I compared the number of the money that Missouri got to every other state that had sued on the same thing, and I saw per capita they'd gotten half the amount of money that the other states had gotten. And I called the executive committee of the multi-state lawsuit, and I said, well, what was the basis of how much money the different states got? And they said, oh, it was per capita. And and it's like, okay, you invited this guy, So the chronology was the thing. If you hadn't connected the fact that the date of the invitation to speak at the PAC thing, the same week that they were in the final negotiations of the settlement, and then compared that to the settlement numbers, and that the chronology is the thing. So I think that old-fashioned, it's not Excel, but I mean, yeah, I use Excel for databases all the time, but I think chronologies are really important.
Yeah, that's great. We're actually, this has been great, but we're going to run out of time soon, so I'm going to open it up to questions, and if you've got, Greg, last couple of takeaways maybe, and if other people have questions, you can get them out there. Who's got a question?
Yeah,
if you want to use the, thanks.
Andrew Sorensen with Time Warner Cable News. Anybody who's put in some of these FOIA requests has probably come back with one or two on their first tries that this request is too broad or we don't have that record. How would you suggest getting around that, or taking a second crack at it to make sure that you get the information you're really looking for?
Yeah.
Greg, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. Well, I've been in Washington for 38 years, so I've filed a lot of FOIA requests, and frankly, I'm somewhat sour a lot of the time about the way the Freedom of Information law works. Just take, for example, the Clinton emails scandal, which I've been working on a lot. I've 4 responses to 4 FOIAs last April in which my request for expedited processing was approved on all 4. My request for fee waiver was approved on all 4. I haven't seen one page yet, and we're in October.
So is there anything you can do or you've learned to do to improve the process?
Sue, take a look at what all these conservative nonprofit groups have been doing to wrest all these documents, and they're all at the front of the line, and that's how people are getting documents. It's a sad commentary on the FOIA. Now, that doesn't cover everything, because we're talking about public records requests that we're filing with lots of different agencies that are not federal. And of course, the State Department of all the agencies in Washington is probably the single worst at processing FOIAs. I've seen, we're filing public records requests, FOIA requests all the time, and I've seen people get stuff back. I always tell the FOIA officer, if this is too broad, come back to me and let's tailor it, because I don't want to be a burden on the taxpayer. I just want the pertinent information that I need. So.
I just add to that, try to understand how the data's, what's behind, how they keep the data is really important. So that way you can ask more specifically. I mean, you have to sort of do your homework, right? For me, it takes a long time to write a really good FOIA request because you have to be really specific. You have to actually know the players involved as you're requesting emails or the actual information you need. But you also really want to understand how the data is kept. I'm doing a little story on a registry motor vehicle scam right now, and and there's a certain type of registry employee who gets certain extra add-ons. But I would have known to ask for the add-on unless I knew how the records were kept in the first place. So just a one tip that helps.
I agree. I mean, you call the Freedom of Information officer, maybe even before you submit the open records request, and say, how do you, if I'm going to do this request, can you search the emails, or your databases? How can you search them? So you tailor the request so that it's actually, that the search is not too difficult for them. And also, there's always this debate. Do I want to go broad because the broader I go, I'll find things that I otherwise wouldn't see, or do you want to go narrow because you're much more likely to get a quicker response the narrower you go? I generally have been going more narrow because, one of the things then you do is you get an initial response more quickly, and then you can follow up and broaden it. Although, of course, that may mean you never see things that you've cut out. But it's just I agree, the State Department, I have to say, I second that motion. The State Department is one of the worst of all, DOD and state in Washington are probably the 2 worst. But, I guess I think the more narrow you can be, and if think in your head, if I were the Freedom of Information officer and I got this request, what would I have to do to respond to it? And then also call up that person and build a relationship with that person. You know, say, you know, not only email, but get on the phone with them. Say, you know, I'm not here to make your job hard. You know, I'd love to, what can I do to narrow this to make it easier? You know, and also, who knows, they could decide to do the query right away. You know, they don't necessarily have to stick with the order that they come in. And you build a relationship with them, they may actually turn it around much more fast. And so those are some of the things.
Can I just jump in with 2 points? I've also taken on the habit of filing FOIAs if I have a whole bunch of stuff that I want from one agency. Sometimes I'll file 2 FOIAs or 3 FOIAs so that they won't be able to hold it back because this material is available, but this material isn't, so we'll just take our sweet time. And the other thing is there's a lot of gaming going on, and Congress didn't make it easier because in order to get expedited processing, you have to spill all this information to the agency, which might alert the agency that you're going to try to come up with some information that's going to put them in a bad light. So it's a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, now? Okay.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Brianna McGurran. I write about student loans for NerdWallet. And I'm just curious, I think a lot of us, I'm sure, have come across stories that we think might be a story behind a story or sort of a germ of an idea that we might want to pursue. But what exact characteristics about the stories that you've worked on make them so worthwhile to you? Or what sort of sticks out in your mind when you come across an idea that makes you want to pursue it further?
I mean, it's something that has impact and that it potentially has the potential for outrage and the potential for impact, you know, and that matters to people. You know, you want it to, that it's going to resonate, that you see the potential that it's going to resonate, I'd say. I mean, I think, again, all of us, all 3 of our stories, you know, that we talked about have those characteristics, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. But you have to show it how it affects people. There's so many things that are wrong, and they're important to write about, but there's so many, you might as well pick the one that people are going to actually want to do something about or help them in some way. I mean, I think a lot about that.
For us, and for me in particular, I took a lot of gratification out of the fact that, I mean, there have been stories written about Motorola before. A guy in Des Moines had a great story about how the city procurement, I think it was, maybe it was the state procurement, I can't remember, they actually had a specification that said that the 2 buttons on the radio had to be 19 millimeters apart. And that only applied to Motorola radio. Actually, the guy who wrote that story used to be a McClatchy guy, and he told somebody that I knew that the Motorola story, nobody was ever going to tell the whole Motorola story because it was too complicated. And for me, that brought a lot of gratification to be able to do that. But also, I just say to you that there are companies who are operating on a state, county, or local basis across the country, and they're doing things that you might not recognize might be a very bad pattern of practice across the country, and they don't get any surveillance, so to speak. They don't get really anybody policing them, and reporters can do that.
Gail?
Okay. Gail DeGeorge, former president at SABEW. All of you are to be applauded for the work you've done. It's really heartening to hear it. But Beth, you in particular struck my heart, and I'll tell you a quick story. I owe a debt of gratitude to Sarah Bartlett for the life of my second son, because at the time, he is now 19 years old, I was working for Business Week, had written a book, I was simply exhausted. Went into preterm labor, was under enormous pressure to get a test done called an amniocentesis, because everyone had to have this done. I was over a certain age, and they wanted to make sure the child did not have Down syndrome. For a lot of different reasons, I refused to get that test. I was under enormous pressure by all kinds, and my doctors are great doctors. Refused to have the test. The child, he's now great, and thank God, because I'm convinced that had I had that test, he would not be here. But what struck me particularly about what you did is that you went against conventional wisdom. The wisdom and the frustration right now a lot is that if you have more information as a consumer, as a healthcare consumer, you will make a better decision. How did you thread your way through that? Do you understand where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I do. I mean, well, so a lot of these tests, there's some validness to that, I think. You want an educated consumer. The most shocking thing of all is, the most scary thing of all is that it is against conventional wisdom, but the conventional wisdom is not in the public, that these tests are so great. Unfortunately, the conventional wisdom is sitting with OBGYNs whose only methodology of learning about these new genetic tests, because there's no regulatory authority, is that a salesperson comes to their door and tells them they have the best test in the world. There's no one looking at independent validation of that test. They then go to a fancy dinner that night. This is totally new, old hat in the pharma world. They go to a fancy dinner, and a doctor they respect from Mass General will tell them that the test is the best thing since sliced bread. So the conventional wisdom is not really in the public arena, I'd argue. It's increasingly, I think it's really sort of with doctors in many ways, and who then impart to the public, and also through DTC, to the public that these tests are the best things since sliced bread. But it's a closed loop system, right? Companies produce the data, they sell it to the doctors who do not understand genetics, and I say that wholeheartedly at all. Many of them don't, I should say, and then they sort of regurgitate it back to the public. So does that make sense?
It does.
So, I don't know if that's helpful.
What you were up against, though, is going to an editor and saying, you know, in this case, genetic testing is not good enough. More information is not a good thing. You know, you can actually get more.
Yeah, no, I didn't come across that, actually. I mean, I didn't. I mean, I think, unfortunately, in the genetic, there's such a rah-rahness to the biotech world right now and life sciences that there's very few critical eyes on it. So I think when I proposed a story, both to McGraw and to, I think it was a Globe, we did it through an NBC and a bunch of places we partner with. No, there's just sort of excitement that, wow, this is really happening. I can't quite believe it.
I'll just say, as somebody who watched her do this and saw it, she had amazing data and reporting all along, which, you know, to second, you know, a lot of what you all have said, as you go along, and as, you know, you were coming up with this and, you know, talking it through with me and your other editors, it became evident that what you had something. It wasn't that
many doctors, including like from, you know, the experts from Harvard on down, said this can't be happening. This is not happening. But it, you know, it obviously became clear it was, and then that breaks up. But that's what we all do. You know, we go against what people think is the truth.
Well, yeah, but from a patient perspective, thank you.
Yeah. Right.
One more question, maybe?
Well, my name's Eric Martin. I work for a shipping newspaper called Tradewinds. And, you know, I've just had a major incident on my beat that I've had to cover. I'm wondering if you could tell us about, you know, how to do it the other way around. If you're going from a major story and you want to investigate it further, you know, how do you know what to hold back for that investigative piece down the road, what to report right away, if any of you have had that experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'm often thrown into situations like that where there's a breaking story that's complex, and I mean, I generally, you know, don't hold back. I mean, in a competitive environment where a story's breaking, you know, you hold it back, and you know, you think, well, I'll get to it, but then, you know, who knows if you're actually going to get to it, and you might be collecting string on ideas and document sources and data sources. And also, you know, interview subjects and personalities that are going to then, you know, but there's always a narrative behind the news story that you can go back and tell that narrative. You can reconstruct, you know, the real story. Yeah. But I wouldn't hold stuff back that's right in front of you. I mean, the federal government is just one of the greatest repositories of data. And there's so many databases. Anytime there's any incident, you know, you can almost always find data that will show you the trend. You know, and I hate sometimes doing those stories. There's the blowout, you know, and then there's all the blowout protectors that you find that data that are the coal mine, you know, and then you do all the coal mine injury data, you know. But all that data is there, and we often don't tap it. But you know, on running stories, you can grab that data pretty quick, and of course you should.
Yeah, I mean, I think the narrative is really, I assume you're talking about the down Pharaoh, whatever it's
Bahamas.
called. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I think constructing that narrative, but understanding there's all these, well, I'm repeating what Eric said.
Yeah, there's a great, I mean, obviously there's a great story about that ship. I mean, talk about an incredible tale that can be reconstructed. You know, wow, you know, you know, the guys presumably are all dead, I guess, right? But still, there's a story that somehow someone has to figure out how to tell.
Yeah. And I would just say, when you do those narratives and you look back, you have to nestle that in the context of something bigger, right? Like the ship went out during a tropical storm that was actually projected, maybe not that quickly, to become potentially a hurricane. It went out for a reason, right? So that's really you got to unlock that in your narrative and nestle that in sort of the pressures against. But yeah, and I bet you'll find really interesting data. There's lots of data on shipping.
Yeah. Yeah. Greg, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think you guys have covered it pretty well. I think that and I agree totally though that the narrative, in terms of, I mean, the best investigative stories I find, or many of the best ones, are written in a narrative, but finding the people, the former employees and the other people who are still alive, and getting them to help you piece that together is the challenge. Good luck with it.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much. This was great. A lot of really great stuff, and thank you all. There you go. It's great. It's good stuff.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's pretty cool to hear.